This is an abomination. Because of this your problem, the marriage will be over.
I can't breathe.
Uncle, I'm not God.
No, you're not.
I'm not God.
But I am
Sit down
begging
there.
for your forgiveness because I did not mean to lie
Every
to
time
you.
forgiveness. How many times I will forgive
The
you?
moment Daniel's uncle pulled his blessing, the air in that room snapped colder than a freezer door left open in December, and Lisa's face drained of color so fast you'd think she'd seen a ghost. Her hands started to shake, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts, and for a second, it looked like she might collapse right there on the tile. Daniel just stood there, frozen, eyes wide, lips parted, as if he'd been sucker punched and couldn't decide whether to fight back or run for the hills. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by Lisa's ragged breathing and the distant sound of a clock ticking somewhere in the house, each second hammering home the reality that everything had changed in an instant. This wasn't just a family disagreement, not some petty squabble over wedding colors or guest lists. This was the kind of moment that splits lives into before and after. The kind that leaves scars you can't see, but never stop feeling. Lisa tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat, and all that came out was a choked sob. She pressed her palms to her cheeks, desperate to hold herself together, but the tears spilled over anyway, hot and silent. Daniel's uncle didn't flinch. His eyes were hard, his jaw set, and the words he'd spoken still hung in the air like a curse. The marriage is over. For Lisa, the ground seemed to tilt beneath her feet. She'd known this meeting would be tough, but nothing could have prepared her for the finality in the uncle's voice, the way he looked at her like she was a stranger who'd brought shame to his doorstep. Daniel, meanwhile, looked like he was trying to do math in his head, calculating the cost of losing everything he'd worked for, everything he'd promised himself about a new life, a new start, a shot at the American dream. But here's the thing. This wasn't just about two people in love. This was about family honor, about centuries of tradition, about the weight of expectations pressing down on Daniel's shoulders until he could barely breathe. For Lisa, it was about more than love too. It was about being seen, being accepted, being forgiven for a past she couldn't erase, no matter how hard she tried. The secrets she'd carried, her marriages, her relationships, the truth about who she'd been and who she was now, were all about to come spilling out. And there was no way to stop the flood. The uncle's words had cracked the dam, and now everything was at risk. Daniel's future, Lisa's hope, the fragile bridge between two worlds that seemed to be crumbling with every second that passed. As Lisa's panic spiraled, Daniel's silence grew heavier, and you could almost see the gears turning behind his eyes. Was he thinking about love? Or was he thinking about the life he'd lose if this marriage fell apart? Was he mourning the relationship, or the green card, or both? The tension in the room was electric, every glance loaded with questions nobody dared to ask out loud. Lisa's chest heaved as she tried to steady herself, but the fear in her eyes said it all. She knew more secrets were about to surface, and she had no idea if Daniel would stand by her when the truth finally came out. The stakes had never been higher, and the next move could change everything. If you think this was the end of the drama, you're in for a wild ride, because what's coming next will make this shock look like a warm-up act. The car ride to Daniel's uncle's house felt like a slow-motion disaster, every mile stretching out the dread in Lisa's chest. She stared out the window, knuckles white on her phone, replaying every possible scenario in her mind, each one worse than the last. Daniel sat beside her, posture stiff, face set in a mask of calm that looked practiced, almost rehearsed. Like he'd spent his whole life preparing for moments when he'd have to swallow his fear and pretend everything was under control. The silence between them was thick, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional nervous tap of Lisa's foot against the floor. She tried to catch Daniel's eye, searching for reassurance, but he kept his gaze fixed straight ahead, jaw clenched, hands gripping the steering wheel a little too tight. As the city faded into dusty roads and the houses grew farther apart, the weight of what was coming pressed down harder. Lisa could feel the history in the air, the sense that this wasn't just a meeting, it was a test, a ritual, a moment that would decide not only her future with Daniel, but her place in a world that felt foreign and unforgiving. She tried to steady her breathing, reminding herself that she'd survived worse, but the truth was, nothing in her life had prepared her for this. Every bump in the road felt like a warning. Every turn a reminder that she was heading straight into the heart of someone else's story, someone else's rules. When they finally pulled up to the uncle's house, Lisa's heart hammered so loud she was sure Daniel could hear it. The house itself was imposing, not because of its size, but because of what it represented: tradition, authority, the kind of family power that could make or break a future with a single word. Daniel took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and gave Lisa a look that was equal parts encouragement and warning. She nodded, swallowing hard, and followed him up the steps, each one heavier than the last. Inside, the air was cool and still. The kind of quiet that makes you want to whisper even when you're alone. Daniel's uncle entered the room with a presence that filled every corner, his eyes sharp, his posture commanding. He didn't need to raise his voice to make it clear who was in charge. Lisa felt herself shrink a little under his gaze, every insecurity rising to the surface. The uncle's expectations hung in the air, unspoken but unmistakable: honesty, respect, and above all, no surprises. But surprises were exactly what he was about to get. The conversation started politely enough, but it didn't take long for the questions to turn pointed, for the smiles to fade. The uncle's tone shifted, his words growing heavier as he asked about Lisa's past, her intentions, her commitment to Daniel and the family. Lisa tried to answer, but her voice trembled, and she could feel the truth pressing at the edges of every sentence. Daniel watched her closely, his calm starting to crack as the pressure mounted. Then, almost casually, the uncle asked about Lisa's previous marriages. The room seemed to freeze, every eye on Lisa as she hesitated, the truth caught in her throat. She managed to say she'd been married before, but the details were vague, her answers slippery. The uncle's eyes narrowed, sensing there was more beneath the surface, and Lisa's anxiety spiked. She knew the real bombshell hadn't even dropped yet, and when it did, the fallout would be impossible to contain. If you think the tension was high now, wait until you hear what Lisa's been hiding about her marriages, because the next revelation is about to blow the roof off this family tribunal. Lisa's voice barely rose above a whisper as she admitted she hadn't just been married once or twice, but 5 times. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and impossible to ignore. The uncle's eyes widened, his jaw tightening as he processed the confession. For a moment, the room was silent, the kind of silence that feels like it's pressing in from all sides. Daniel's face was unreadable, but his hands fidgeted in his lap, betraying the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. Lisa tried to explain, her words tumbling out in a rush, but the uncle cut her off with a sharp gesture. He wanted facts, not excuses, and he wanted them now. Then came the second blow. Lisa, voice shaking, admitted she was still legally married to a woman in America. The uncle's reaction was instant and fierce. His face twisted in disbelief, then anger, and he spat out the word abomination like it burned his tongue. The accusation wasn't just about the marriages or the lies, it was about something deeper, something that struck at the heart of his beliefs and his sense of family honor. Lisa's past relationships with women, her hidden life, were suddenly on trial, and the verdict was already written in the uncle's eyes. Lisa's desperation grew with every second. She pleaded for understanding, her voice cracking as she tried to explain that her life in America was different, that she'd made mistakes but was trying to move forward. She insisted she wasn't hiding anymore, that she wanted to be honest, but the words sounded hollow in the face of the uncle's outrage. He shook his head, his disappointment clear, and told her that her actions had brought shame to his family. Lisa's shoulders slumped, her hopes slipping away as she realized there was no easy way out of this mess. Daniel sat in silence, his eyes darting between Lisa and his uncle. You could see the conflict written all over his face. Was he thinking about the woman he claimed to love, or was he calculating what this disaster meant for his own future? The promise of a new life in America, The dream he'd chased for so long was suddenly slipping through his fingers. Did he care more about Lisa? Or about the green card and the opportunities waiting on the other side of the ocean? The question hung in the air, unspoken but impossible to ignore. Lisa reached for Daniel's hand, searching for support. But he hesitated, his fingers twitching before he finally took hers. The gesture was small, but it spoke volumes. Was it love? Or was it survival? Was Daniel standing by Lisa because he believed in her? Or because he couldn't bear to let go of his own dreams? The room was thick with tension, every glance loaded with suspicion and doubt. If you think Daniel's loyalty is a sure thing, think again, because the next move he makes will reveal where his heart truly lies, and it might not be what anyone expects. Lisa's knees hit the floor before she even realized what she was doing, the cold tile biting through her jeans as she clasped her hands together and begged for forgiveness. Her voice shook, words tumbling out in a desperate rush, but the uncle's face stayed hard as stone. He didn't move, didn't blink, didn't offer even a flicker of sympathy. The room felt colder with every second, the silence broken only by Lisa's choked sobs and the sound of her breath catching in her throat. She tried to explain, to plead, to promise that she'd changed, but the uncle's eyes never softened. He looked at her like she was a problem to be solved, not a person to be understood. Daniel stepped forward, his voice low and urgent, trying to bridge the gap between his fiancée and his uncle. He spoke of love, of second chances, of the future they could build together if only the past could be forgiven. But the uncle cut him off with a wave of his hand, his pride wounded and his patience gone. He reminded Daniel that family reputation was not a bargaining chip, that honor was not something you could trade for comfort or convenience. The words stung, and Daniel's shoulders slumped as he realized how little power he had in this room. He tried again, softer this time, asking his uncle to see Lisa as a human being, not just a collection of mistakes. But the uncle's pride was a wall, and Daniel's words bounced off it, leaving only echoes behind. Lisa's tears came faster, her breath growing shallow and ragged. She pressed her hands to her chest, trying to steady herself, but the panic was rising, hot and uncontrollable. Her vision blurred, the edges of the room closing in as she gasped for air. The uncle watched her with a cold detachment, his arms crossed, his expression unmoved. He accused her of putting on a show, of using her tears as a weapon, and told her flatly that he didn't believe a word she said. The accusation cut deep, and Lisa's panic tipped over into a full-blown attack. She rocked back and forth, clutching her knees, her sobs echoing off the walls. But the uncle only grew more irritated, his voice sharp as he told her to stop crying, to stop pretending, to accept the consequences of her actions. Daniel knelt beside Lisa, his hand on her back, whispering words of comfort that sounded hollow in the face of his uncle's anger. He tried to shield her from the worst of it, but there was only so much he could do. The uncle's words hung in the air, heavy and final. This marriage would not happen. Not with his blessing, not with his support. The shame, he said, was too great. The risk to the family's reputation too high. Lisa's sobs grew quieter, her body shaking as she tried to process the reality of what was happening. She looked up at Daniel, her eyes pleading, but he could only offer a weak smile, his own fear and disappointment written across his face. The cultural divide in the room was impossible to ignore. Lisa's pleas for understanding, her insistence that people could change, that love should be enough, clashed with the uncle's unwavering commitment to tradition and honor. In America, Lisa might have been forgiven, might have been given a second chance. But here, in this house, the rules were different. The family's reputation was everything, and forgiveness was not given lightly. The uncle's authority was absolute, his word law, and Lisa's tears did nothing to change that. As the minutes dragged on, the tension in the room only grew. Lisa's panic attack subsided, but the humiliation lingered, a raw ache in her chest. She wiped her eyes, her hands trembling, and tried to find her voice again. She apologized over and over, her words growing softer each time, but the uncle remained unmoved. He told her that forgiveness was not his to give, that her actions had consequences, and that she would have to live with them. The words landed like blows, each one a reminder of how far she was from home, how alone she felt in this moment. Daniel tried one last time to appeal to his uncle's sense of compassion, but the older man shook his head, his expression resolute. He told Daniel that love was not enough, that some mistakes could not be undone, and that the family's honor must come first. Daniel's face fell, the hope draining from his eyes as he realized there was nothing left to say. He looked at Lisa, his heart breaking for her, but also for himself, for the future slipping away with every word his uncle spoke. Lisa sat back on her heels, her body exhausted, her spirit battered. She looked around the room, searching for any sign of hope, but found only closed faces and cold stares. The humiliation was complete. The power dynamic clear, she was at the mercy of forces she couldn't control, trapped between her past and a future that seemed to be slipping further away with every passing second. The uncle stood, signaling that the conversation was over, his decision final. But as he turned to leave, he paused, his eyes lingering on Daniel and Lisa. He said that this matter was bigger than any one person, that the family elders and spiritual leaders would have to be consulted before any final decision could be made. The words hung in the air, a new threat, a new layer of judgment waiting just around the corner. If you thought the family tribunal was intense, wait until the elders get involved, because the next round of judgment is about to begin, and the stakes have never been higher. The uncle's decision to bring in the elders landed like a fresh blow, and Lisa felt her stomach twist as the reality set in. This wasn't just about one man's opinion anymore. Now, her fate, and Daniel's, would be decided by a council of elders, men whose word carried the weight of generations, whose approval or condemnation could ripple through the entire community. Daniel's uncle made the call, his voice low and steady, and within the hour, the living room began to fill with the slow, deliberate footsteps of men in crisp, traditional attire, each one radiating authority. Lisa's heart pounded as she watched them take their seats, their faces unreadable, their eyes sharp and searching. Daniel stood beside her, his hands clenched at his sides, every muscle in his body tense with anticipation and fear. Lisa's dread grew with every passing minute. She could feel the eyes of the elders on her, measuring her, weighing her worth against the standards of a world she barely understood. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, as the elders exchanged quiet words with Daniel's uncle, their voices too low for her to catch. She tried to steady her breathing, but her mind raced with every mistake, every secret, every moment that had led her to this point. Daniel glanced at her, his face tight with worry, and for a moment she saw the boy beneath the bravado, the son desperate to please his family and terrified of losing everything he'd worked for. The elders wasted no time. One of them, a man with a deep, commanding voice, asked Lisa to stand and speak her truth. The room fell silent, every eye fixed on her, and Lisa felt her knees threaten to buckle. She took a shaky breath and began, her voice trembling as she confessed to her past marriages, her relationships with women, her mistakes and regrets. She spoke of her life in America, of the choices she'd made, of the love she felt for Daniel, and her hope for a second chance. The words spilled out, raw and unfiltered, and for a moment, the room seemed to soften, the elders listening with a kind of grave attention that made Lisa's heart ache with hope. But as she finished, the silence returned, heavier than before. The elders exchanged glances, their faces inscrutable, and Lisa felt the weight of their judgment pressing down on her. One elder asked her why she had lied, why she had hidden so much from Daniel and his family. Lisa's eyes filled with tears as she tried to explain, her voice cracking with emotion. She spoke of fear, of shame, of wanting to protect Daniel from the truth, but the words sounded thin in the face of the elder's disappointment. Another elder asked Daniel if he truly understood what he was choosing, if he was prepared to bear the consequences of marrying a woman with such a complicated past. Daniel hesitated, his eyes flicking to Lisa, then to his uncle, then back to the elders. He said he loved Lisa, that he wanted to build a life with her. But his voice lacked conviction, the words falling flat in the heavy air. The community's reaction was swift and unforgiving. Murmurs rippled through the room, some shaking their heads, others whispering behind their hands. Lisa felt the sting of their judgment, the sense that she was an outsider, a threat to the order they had worked so hard to maintain. Daniel's uncle stood tall, his pride wounded but his authority intact, and he reminded the elders of the family's reputation, of the risk to their standing in the community if they allowed this marriage to go forward. The elders nodded, their faces grave, and Lisa felt her hope slipping away with every word. But then, something shifted. One of the younger elders, a man with kind eyes and a gentle voice, spoke up. He asked Lisa if she truly loved Daniel, if she was willing to embrace their culture, to respect their traditions, to build a future rooted in honesty and respect. Lisa nodded, her voice steady for the first time, and she promised to do whatever it took to earn their trust. The elder looked at the others, his words hanging in the air, and for a moment, the tension in the room eased. The elders began to debate, their voices rising and falling in a rhythm that spoke of years of shared history, of battles fought and lessons learned. Daniel watched the elders, his desperation clear in every line of his body. He pleaded with them, his words tumbling out in a rush, promising to honor his family, to protect their reputation, to make them proud. The elders listened, their faces unreadable, and Lisa felt her heart race as she realized that the outcome was still uncertain. The room was thick with possibility, the sense that everything could change in an instant, that forgiveness might be within reach if only the right words were spoken. As the elders continued to debate, Lisa's mind raced with hope and fear. She knew that a reversal was possible, that the elders could choose mercy over judgment, that they could give her and Daniel a chance to start over. But she also knew that the odds were against them, that the weight of tradition and reputation might be too much to overcome. The room was a crucible, every word and gesture shaping the future in ways no one could predict. If you think the elders' verdict is set in stone, think again, because the next decision could turn everything upside down and the final word hasn't been spoken yet. The elders' debate had barely begun before the questions started circling Daniel like vultures. One of the older men, his voice sharp and direct, asked Daniel to look him in the eye and say, without hesitation, why he wanted to marry Lisa. The room went silent. Every breath held as Daniel's lips parted and his gaze flickered between Lisa and the floor. He said he loved her, that she was special, that he wanted to build a life with her. But the words felt thin, almost rehearsed, and the elders weren't buying it. Another elder pressed harder, asking if Daniel's dreams of America had anything to do with his devotion. The question hung in the air, heavy and dangerous, and Daniel's face flushed as he stammered out a denial. He insisted his feelings were real, that the green card was just a bonus, not the reason. But the suspicion lingered, and even Lisa seemed to shrink a little, her eyes searching Daniel's face for the truth. Lisa's sincerity was next on the chopping block. The elders turned to her, their questions relentless. Did she regret her past, or was she only sorry because she'd been caught? Was she truly ready to embrace a new culture, or was she running from something back home? Lisa tried to answer, her voice trembling but determined. She spoke of regret, of lessons learned, of wanting to start fresh. But the elders pressed on, asking why she hadn't told Daniel everything from the start, why she'd let him walk into the storm blind. Lisa's eyes filled with tears as she admitted her fear, her shame, her hope that love would be enough to bridge the gap. But the elders were unmoved, their skepticism clear. They'd seen too many outsiders come and go, too many promises broken, too many families left to pick up the pieces. Daniel's uncle watched the exchange, his face a mask of conflict. He'd always been the guardian of family honor, the keeper of tradition, but now he found himself torn. On one hand, he wanted to protect Daniel, to shield him from heartbreak and humiliation. On the other, he felt the pull of tradition, the weight of expectations that had shaped his life and the lives of those before him. He looked at Daniel, at Lisa, at the elders, and for a moment his resolve wavered. Was it better to cling to the old ways, or to risk everything for the chance at something new? The question gnawed at him, and the answer seemed further away with every passing minute. The elders' debate grew heated, voices rising and falling as they weighed forgiveness against exile. Some argued that everyone deserves a second chance, that love can change even the most stubborn hearts. Others insisted that the family's reputation was too important, that allowing this marriage would set a dangerous precedent. The room crackled with tension, every word a spark that threatened to ignite a firestorm. Lisa sat on the edge of her seat, her hands clenched in her lap, her heart pounding as she waited for the verdict. Daniel's eyes darted from face to face, searching for a sign of hope, a hint of mercy. One elder, his voice softer than the rest, asked Daniel if he would still marry Lisa if it meant never leaving Nigeria. The question landed like a punch, and Daniel hesitated, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for an answer. Lisa's breath caught in her throat, her eyes locked on Daniel's face. For a moment, the room was silent, the only sound the ticking of a clock on the wall. Daniel finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, saying he loved Lisa and wanted to be with her, no matter where they lived. But the uncertainty in his eyes told a different story, and the elders exchanged knowing glances. The uncle's struggle was written all over his face. He wanted to believe in Daniel, to trust that his nephew's heart was in the right place. But the doubts lingered, fueled by years of watching people chase dreams that led them far from home. He looked at Lisa, at the pain and hope in her eyes, and wondered if she truly understood what she was asking. Was she ready to give up everything for Daniel, to become part of a family and a culture that might never fully accept her? The question swirled, unanswered and unanswerable. As the debate dragged on, the elders began to split into factions. Some argued for forgiveness, for giving Daniel and Lisa a chance to prove themselves. Others pushed for exile, for cutting ties and protecting the family from further shame. The tension in the room was palpable, every word a battle, every glance a challenge. Lisa felt the weight of their judgment pressing down on her, and Daniel's desperation grew with every passing second. Just when it seemed the elders were about to reach a decision, Daniel stood up, his voice clear and strong for the first time. He looked at the elders, at his uncle, at Lisa, and said he had something to confess. The room froze, every eye on him, as he took a deep breath and prepared to reveal a secret that could change everything. If you think you know where Daniel's loyalties lie, you're about to be surprised, because his next words will turn this entire story on its head. Lisa's knees hit the floor again, this time with a force that made everyone in the room flinch. She didn't care about dignity anymore, not with everything on the line. Her voice cracked as she begged the elders for mercy, her words tumbling out in a rush, raw and desperate. She promised to honor their traditions, to respect their family, to do whatever it took to prove she was worthy of Daniel and their trust. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. She wanted them to see her pain, her sincerity, her willingness to humble herself in front of people who held her future in their hands. The elders watched in silence, their faces unreadable, but Lisa pressed on, her voice growing hoarse as she pleaded for one more chance, for forgiveness, for a path forward that didn't end in exile and heartbreak. Daniel couldn't stay silent any longer. He stepped forward, his voice trembling but determined, and addressed the elders with a passion that surprised even himself. He spoke of love, of the journey he and Lisa had taken to get here, of the mistakes they'd made and the lessons they'd learned. He admitted his own faults, his own fears, and asked the elders to judge him not just by his dreams of America, but by the man he was trying to become. He told them he loved Lisa, that he wanted to build a life with her, whether in Nigeria or anywhere else, and that he was willing to accept whatever consequences came with that choice. The room was silent as Daniel finished, his words hanging in the air, heavy with hope and uncertainty. For a long moment, no one moved. The elders exchanged glances, their expressions grave, and Daniel's uncle stood apart, arms crossed, his face a mask of conflict. Then, slowly, the uncle stepped forward, his eyes locked on Daniel. He spoke quietly, his voice softer than anyone had heard all day. He said he'd spent his whole life protecting the family, guarding its reputation, making sure that every decision honored the generations that came before. But he also admitted that times were changing, that love and forgiveness had to mean something, even when it was hard. He looked at Lisa, at the pain and hope in her eyes, and said that while he couldn't forget the past, he was willing to consider a future where forgiveness was possible. The words landed like a shockwave, and for the first time, hope flickered in Lisa's eyes. The elders began to murmur among themselves, their voices low and urgent. Some argued that tradition must be upheld, that the family's honor was too important to risk. Others pointed to Lisa's humility, her willingness to beg for forgiveness, her promise to respect their ways. The debate grew heated, the room crackling with tension, as each elder weighed the risks and rewards of letting Lisa and Daniel move forward together. Lisa sat back on her heels, exhausted, her hands shaking as she waited for the verdict. Daniel stood beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, his own nerves barely contained. Finally, the eldest of the group raised his hand, and the room fell silent. He spoke slowly, his words deliberate, as he laid out the elders' decision. They would allow Lisa and Daniel to marry, but only under strict conditions. Lisa would have to undergo a period of probation, living with the family and learning their customs, proving her commitment to their way of life. Any sign of disrespect, any hint of dishonesty, and the marriage would be called off immediately. Daniel would be held responsible for her actions, his own standing in the family tied to her success or failure. The consequences were clear. This was their last chance, and any misstep would mean exile for both of them. Lisa nodded, tears streaming down her face, relief and gratitude flooding her body. She promised to do whatever it took, to work every day to earn their trust, to build a future that honored both her past and their traditions. Daniel squeezed her hand, his own eyes shining with emotion, and thanked the elders for their mercy. The uncle stepped forward, placing a hand on Daniel's shoulder, and told him that while the road ahead would be hard, he believed in his nephew's strength and Lisa's determination. The words were simple, but they meant everything. But even as relief washed over the room, a sense of unease lingered. Not everyone was convinced that Lisa could truly change, that Daniel's motives were as pure as he claimed. Some elders warned that the family would be watching closely, that any sign of trouble would be met with swift and final judgment. Lisa and Daniel exchanged a look, understanding that their journey was far from over, that the hardest part might still be ahead. As the meeting ended, the elders filed out, their faces a mix of hope and skepticism. Lisa and Daniel were left alone in the quiet room, the weight of the day settling over them like a heavy blanket. They knew they'd been given a second chance, but it came with strings attached, with expectations and consequences that would shape every moment of their new life together. Lisa wiped her eyes, her voice barely above a whisper, as she thanked Daniel for standing by her, for believing in her when no one else would. Daniel pulled her close, promising that they'd face whatever came next together, no matter how hard it got. But as they left the uncle's house, hand in hand, a new question hung in the air. Would Lisa be able to win over the rest of the family, to prove herself in a world that still saw her as an outsider? Would Daniel's loyalty hold strong when tested by the pressures of tradition, community, and the ever-present lure of a different life across the ocean? The answers were far from certain, and the road ahead promised more twists, more challenges, and more moments where everything could change in an instant. If you think this story is finished, you're in for a shock. because the next chapter is about to bring even more drama, more secrets, and a test of loyalty that will push Lisa and Daniel to their limits. Don't miss what happens when the rest of the family gets involved, because in this world, forgiveness is never simple, and every choice comes with a price.